biggest thing is the ability to make an impact.
From that moment onwards, we moved from being a brand that advertised to a brand that communicated.
We collaborate with our clients, and over time, we try and get them to fire us.
You must have to have really difficult conversations.
I want to see no office wall. I want to see everything covered in ideas.
There's so much data available that you can kind of get dazzled by it. And
What the hell are you doing?
Hello, my name's Katie Sanzo and welcome to the Marketing Forum podcast, where we learn about the professional world of brilliant marketers, communicators and creatives. In this episode, we're joined by Nicola Millard, Principal Innovation Partner with BT. Her background in psychology and experience of doing loads of trends research makes her absolutely fascinating to us marketers. We talk about the difference between engaging with B2B and B2C audiences, why some of their research shows that customers actually don't really care about channel, the impact of the pandemic on both customers and employees, and why she hopes we won't forget everything we've learned. I really hope you enjoy this episode.
So, hi Nicola, thank you so much for joining us on the Marketing Forum podcast.
Hello.
Hi. So your role with BT and innovation, head of innovation.
I'm not head of innovation, but I am a principal innovation partner, which I think is an improvement from one of my previous job titles, which was Futurologist. So yes, I was one of BT's Futurologists for a while, and of course, marketers loved that title. I have to say, I'm not sure I was quite so enamoured with it, mainly because at parties when you introduce yourself and someone says, "What do you do?" and you say, "I'm a futurologist," and it's always, well, where's your crystal ball then? I did actually, someone very kindly gave me a crystal ball when I was a futurologist. Sadly, I could see no future in it.
You still have the ball though.
I do still have it. It just doesn't work. And to be honest, I'm definitely not somebody that spends my entire life looking at crystal balls or tea leaves. So I am a researcher by heart. But yes, no, I'm now a principal innovation partner. So I'm part of BT's broader innovation team, really trying to work with and for, I guess, our usually larger corporate and public sector companies in the UK. So my job really is, well, it's effectively speed dating. So it's really trying to harness the incredible innovation capability that we have in BT, which includes our own researchers. So I am normally based at the lovely Adastral Park, which is our main research and innovation headquarters. It's just outside Ipswich. Of course, I am not there today. I am actually in my house, which is in Ipswich. So I'm about 7 miles away from Adastral. But we have it's a little bit like our own university campus up there. So lots of researchers, lots of people doing innovation, and then also not just BT people. So our partners, we've got universities, we've got startups, we've got all sorts of people there. But that's just the hub, I guess. And then we've got all the spokes, which would include a lot of fantastic academic partners. And to be honest, I work quite extensively with those guys. So we've got our own lab at MIT in Boston.
Nice.
They're the crazy people. And they're lovely, but slightly crazy.
Are they as uber nerdy as the stereotype?
Yeah, some of them certainly are.
Super.
Yes. And then we've got slightly closer to home, Cambridge University just down the road. We've got Bristol University, Tsinghua in China as well. But I mean, we have partnerships with lots of universities. And then, of course, Scouts just looking at interesting technologies coming out around the world as well. So there's all that going on. And then my role, I guess, is to try and make sure that we harness all of that innovation, not just internally, but actually look and see if we can start to solve problems for our customers as well, and work with our customers on innovation.
So that's essentially about kind of maybe product and service development in the longer term, following trends, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is. And although that's less my role, I always say that the innovation's got a continuum, and I'm kind of right at the beginning. But most of the team are very much engineers and computer scientists, and really working on, can we try stuff, do proof of concepts, and obviously with innovation, particularly around things like 5G, which is a relatively new technology. What can we start to layer on top of it? We call it a digital fabric. So how can we knit together different technologies underpinned by the network and start to do things differently? So most of the team do that. I've got a slightly different role, mainly because, well, firstly, I am a technologist, but I'm only half a technologist. Actually, most of me is a psychologist. So I do the interesting people bits, because, as I always claim, that the most disruptive part of innovation is not the technology, it is us. Really, it's trying to understand the people's relationships with technology. But it's also, I guess, because I understand technology, but I do try and demystify it and debunk some of the hype as well. I tend to try and interact with C-level people, so people who are not necessarily computer scientists. Some of them are, of course, but just want to know how this technology can solve some of their problems, or how this impacts strategically to their business. So a lot of my work is really talking to very senior people about the implications of this technology, and obviously tracking some of the trends as well, to try and figure out what does 5G mean for businesses? What does AI mean for businesses? All of those kind of things. But then also looking at overlaying on top of that is, why would people actually want to use these technologies in the first place? And how does that change behavior?
I think it's really the kind of AI, VR side of things. I think that for me, what's great about them is the progressive nature. It's supposed to be about connectivity, but the only reason I can see why people would use them, particularly from a marketing perspective, is if it's enhancing an experience or it makes it easier. And the reality is if you go into a space and it's like, oh, here's a VR headset, and you just think like, well, I don't really need one, because I can just look at that because it's right there.
Yes.
So I think those kinds of experiences are ones where you just think like, God, like, let's hope we don't all run away with ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, VR, I think, is a particularly interesting one on a number of levels, because it's been around a while, virtual reality now. And I think one of the problems is the headset. I'm a glasses wearer, so instantly you end up with glasses, which is not comfortable. Then, of course, I have to say, I used to call it vomity reality as well, because generally if you put a headset on me, I usually needed a bucket.
But that's not unusual though, is it? It's quite common for people just to be like, whoa.
It is, and it's very disorienting. And I think actually 5G overcomes some of the problem, because the problem often with the lag. So a slight lag between what you would normally perceive and what you are perceiving within VR can cause your brain to start to go, what the hell's going on? Oh, it's a bit of a weird world. Let's make you throw up. So I think VR's got some quite interesting human factors problems that it needs to solve. And the technology is getting a lot better. But then you've got to say, okay, so the technology is getting there. What's it actually used for, and what's it useful for? And I mean, I do a lot around technology acceptance, and useful and used are there are three U's. There's useful, usable, used. They're my three U's test around why would people adopt this technology in the first place. So with VR, is it useful? Well, actually, I think it is. There are two areas: gaming. Now that's the most promising area, I think, for VR. But for businesses, it's training. Exactly. Training, simulation. I think when you, particularly we've done some stuff, oil rig simulations, for example, which are very expensive to do. You're going to try and stage them in reality. So that kind of thing you can do very effectively in VR.
Even things like hospitality, like where stuff is in the kitchen before you come and start working, like stuff like that.
Potentially. I think AR maybe has a little bit more, and I'll talk about AR because I think that's a slightly different technology. But for VR, I think one of the things, certainly the pandemic has thrown up the fact that we tend to do everything in 2D, on Zoom or on Teams or on WebEx. It's all a bit flat. It's on the screen. So can we start to make collaboration a little bit more 3D? And obviously VR might address that. But the problem then is, given that we're all on back-to-back meetings, do I want to stay in a headset for 7 hours a day? Probably not. So that's where I think that technology might fall down. AR, however, augmented reality, I think has got some really interesting applications. So that obviously you can see reality as well as seeing what's in the digital world. So, and it could use glasses. They're usually slightly less, massive than the VR ones, and potentially could just clip on a normal pair of eyeglasses as well. But that obviously can overlay the world. So we actually did some simulations around again training. But if you can give somebody a task to do and then overlay the instructions on top of the actual things that they're having to manipulate, actually that's pretty good. So it gives them some idea of how to do things. So we're looking at sort of applications for AR, ranging from all sorts of things, to be perfectly honest. I mean, we've got, I think the most exciting one is our 5G ambulance, where we've equipped a paramedic with an AR headset, and also a haptic glove, so a glove that transmits touch. And using 5G, we can start to transmit, high definition real-time video back to a remote medic, either in a VR headset or an AR headset. And then obviously the haptic glove transmits touch as well. So the idea there is obviously the remote medic can guide the paramedic through procedures that potentially they wouldn't be able to do unsupervised. Hopefully we can start to reduce hospital admissions as well on that. So that's being trialled at the moment in the West Midlands. And then we've got all sorts of things. We've got crane inspectors in Belfast using AR headsets. Now they're climbing cranes for a living. So, you don't want to give them technologies that they have to hold. So again, they've got checklists they've got in front of their eyes. They can bring in a remote person if they need a second opinion. We're also looking at tethering drones as well into the AR headset, so that they don't actually necessarily have to climb up the entire crane. So there's loads of stuff there as well, which I think that's potentially quite compelling use of those technologies. But yeah, I mean, I think AR starts to pass my 3 use test. Is it useful? Is it usable? And who else is using it? Is my main criteria for looking as to whether technology is going to be accepted or rejected.
Yeah, definitely. Like you say, around where the people I know that are most using them is in gaming, or in tourism, around sort of experience enhancement.
Yes,
debatably, but definitely in gaming. And obviously for marketers, gaming is a nice field of brand awareness, bit of flogging.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, gaming, I think the sort of very compelling experiences I think could work on VR. I mean, I would also state that maybe you're not going to be sitting 7 hours a day using it, but I'm having seen some kids using their gaming consoles that possibly may be sitting for 7 hours with it on, but largely you can choose to do that. I think the difference between that and business is that if you're going to have a VR meeting, everyone has to be in a VR headset, and that if you have a vomit problem like I do, it's not going to be comfortable.
But it's also whether or not that's needed. So why would you need to have a VR meeting over a normal meeting?
Well, exactly, yeah. And I think, again, the useful, usable, used thing comes back in. So what's it useful for? Well, maybe if you're actually having to manipulate a physical environment and you need everyone to be in that physical environment, but they're not in the physical environment, that could well be a good way of doing it. I would also suggest you could do that in augmented reality as well. So it might be a better option, given that we get less reports of vomit with augmented reality, it has to be said.
I'm excited that you actually get reports of vomit from the VR.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, that's because we do research, and a lot of the universities play with these technologies and then definitely document when 3 students
sick
wrong.
Today. It's going down. I think the part I think all of it's interesting, but the part that I think probably is really interesting to marketers is the fact that you're a psychologist. I think most marketers would want to carry a little pocket version of you around with them. Why did they just behave like that, Nicola? So you know, like you say, you talk about this idea that the most challenging element of innovation in a way is, people getting us to use it, etc. How do you do some of the research around that? Do you do some of the stuff that, for example, we might do, which is just straight surveying, watching, MVPing? Is that the same sort of thing that you guys look at?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a very big intersection with the kind of stuff I do. In fact, I was briefly in BT marketing at one point as well. So yeah, I mean, we do a lot of research surveys, fairly traditional stuff. We do, particularly on that. So I look at the two human sides, so the customer side and the employee side. So on the customer side, we do a regular piece of research called the Autonomous Customer, which is a piece of panel research effectively, so and it's global as well, and we've been doing that every other year for 10 years.
Wow.
And that, I mean, it's very unique, and it's the great thing about that is you can start to look tangibly at the movable trends.
Right. I bet you've got some great data.
Oh yeah, I mean, I that piece of research I look forward to every time we do it, because, well, firstly, there's always things that are surprising in it, but also you just looking at some of the mundane ebbs and flows simply around things like what channels do customers want to contact organizations over. That's ebbed and flowed over the years, and you can even see hype cycles. So when social media was, the hot topic of conversation, was probably 2015. I think there were whole conferences in social media for marketing and social media for service, and you could see the sort of hype, and then suddenly the dip after the hype.
It's like, I've got Twitter, so I'm going to tweet BT with this issue.
Exactly right. And then we documented. I mean, with Twitter, especially, customers were expecting if they tweeted you that you get a reply within 15 minutes. Now, it has to be said that some companies do that. I think retail especially are pretty good at that. But sometimes you never get a response at all. No. So then you start to use other channels, and the problem then is that you end up, I mean, certainly from when you look at strategy perspective, the worst case scenario is you end up with the same problem from the same customer on 3 different channels being picked up by 3 different bits of the business, because they look after the different channels, and then they give 3 different answers, which is even worse. So, so there are, and obviously there's cost associated with that as well as obviously customer experience issues. So I mean, that's all absolutely meaty and fascinating data. I prefer also allying that with some qualitative stuff as well. So I used to do a lot of ethnography. In fact, I did a whole TED talk on ticket machines at one point, because I am that geeky. I sat and watched people use ticket machines in train stations and airports.
I bet people still struggle with them.
Yeah, I mean, they do, and I don't do formally study anymore, but my inner anthropologist, I think, sometimes just sits and watch people. I always say I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a pure psychologist. I am very much interested in how people and technology interact together.
Right.
So when, again, at parties, people go, "Oh, are you analysing me?" No, not unless you use some technology, in which case I might get quite interested.
I did just watch you use your phone though, exactly. And that was an absolute.
That's me.
It's so I actually I booked a flight at the weekend, and so I suppose I haven't done that for 18 months for a start, but then also when I was doing it, and I was just like, this website surely hasn't considered my user experience at all. But then equally, there's a part of you that just thinks it's just me, but it, if it's me, it's got to be others.
Yeah, and I think that's why. I mean, I was in usability for a very long time. We my first job in BT was in our human factors division, which is why, I mean, people often voice astonishment that there's a psychologist working in BT. But at the time I went into BT, there were a significant number of social scientists, because I think at the time it was the biggest industrial human factors unit in Europe. And it was a fascinating mix of people. So you had your anthropologists, ergonomists, sociologists, psychologists, lots of ologies going on there, all working together to try and make technology work better for people. And although we don't have so many now, I always say we have quality rather than quantity, that there's still the factor that you have to start to look at how people use the technologies, because I think technologists are brilliant and they love the technology and they get very carried away with it sometimes, and it is often really clever. But then you put it in front of somebody, anyone, me, Joe Public, my mum, and suddenly the reality hits that what they've designed is incredibly clever, but can't be used by any normal person.
There's that really funny video, isn't there, of like the user testing where you've got all the holes for the shapes. And
Yes,
the person
that's
just
right.
puts it all through the same one. And the software developer's like, no, what are you doing? It's so obvious.
Yeah, oddly enough, I think I've been witness to something very similar.
I bet you've seen some absolute peaches of
Yeah. And I think that's why it's very important to test things. And there's no such thing as an average user. I think that's one of the problems that but I mean, even just testing for visual impairment, color blindness, all of those kind of things are really important. And that, again, if you get the subject who's colorblind, you know, that red button and that green button actually don't mean an awful lot to them because they can't process the color. So you may need to think about redesigning that.
That's so interesting, isn't it? Are you seeing a lot at the moment around one of the things that we've been looking at? I work quite often with B2B clients, and it's around the self-serve for a client around things like, interacting, do I actually want to, in the first instance, have a conversation with someone about what you're trying to sell me? Or do I want to explore it quite heavily, independently, without anyone giving me the sales blurb?
Yeah.
I'm assuming you've probably done quite a lot around that for BT.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the research we do on customers is often, it's kind of skewed towards B2C, quite a lot of it. But then people go, well, B2B is very different. I don't think it is, because actually a lot of the attributes of B2C come into the B2B space. Because
it's still a person using it ultimately.
Right. Exactly right. Now, there are some subtle differences. And I think in terms of shopping behaviors, actually there are some both parallels and differences between B2B and B2C. I think the first thing is, when it matters to you, you do your research regardless. And I think that the thing that we found with B2B journeys is that actually they tend to involve the company slightly later in the buying process than maybe in the B2C. So in other words, they've usually done their homework. They've usually looked at all of the materials that are available online, done the compare and contrast. And then at that point they go, well, it's this company and this company, let's go and ask them. Whereas we probably don't necessarily do that quite as rigorously if we're, shopping for a garden shed or something, so yeah, I mean, there are some differences, but then I think B2B, the real difference we see is actually in the relationship bit. Relationships are a lot more important in B2B than they are in B2C. And that's where your good, account guys, your sales guys, those relationship managers really do come in, because I think most customers, particularly if they're big customers of yours, they want you to understand their business. They want to understand the problems. They want you to give them the solution that actually is going to solve those problems, rather than the overt sales pitch. So I think that's a really interesting one around the relationship bit in the research. Really does come out as the most important part of the B2B experience.
It's so interesting, like even around how you actually reach B2B audiences and relationships, particularly with stuff, you think you're a senior person to be in a B2B business. You're not Googling necessarily how you find a particular service when you've got contacts that can tell you about an experience they've just had.
Yeah.
And so suddenly the power shift of, like you say, relationship, brand, searchability.
Yeah.
That's for me where B2B is different than B2C. It's just like, I sometimes have found it relatively easy to sell something to a consumer. It's much harder to sell to a business.
Yeah, and I think duration of the relationship is often longer as well. I mean, particularly when you're talking about things like telecoms, it's usually a contractual thing that's maybe, it could be 10 years.
Yeah.
So it's like committing to a marriage, isn't it?
Right.
So you want to make sure that you can get on with the person.
Yeah.
So I think that the duration is often longer. Often, obviously, the price tag is often bigger. The risk could be bigger as well.
Hugely.
So I think that's why that relationship piece really does come in, and the fact that people really do their homework.
And that's why that purchasing window is so long. It can be so long, can't it? It can be, it can be up to a year. It could be over a year probably, but I've seen it take up to a year.
It can do for the complex stuff. I think the other thing on the less complex stuff, the stuff that people are, maybe it's a renew, or it's something that's not so risky. That's more of a B2C behavior.
Exactly.
So
just do it.
Do it on SelfServe. absolutely fine to do that. But if it's complex and risky, you can do it on self-serve, but probably most people would be more inclined, unless they're super confident, to want to be handheld, to want to be reassured that this is absolutely the right thing, to want their business to be understood. So yeah, all of those things I think really maybe push against putting self-service in. We've actually done quite a lot of categorization, particularly around channel choices, around why customers tend to choose the channels that they choose. Because as I said, we plot the ebbs and flows over the years. And actually, the one thing that we learned was customers really don't care about channels. They mostly care about their goal. So in other words, they have a goal.
Yeah.
They want to get to that goal. Now, underlying that goal is an intention state. And that intention state normally is either positive, negative, or neutral. So a positive intention state, we call these customers visionaries. They want to do what they're doing. So, they're being ambitious, they're building their business, they're expanding, they're buying something that's going to really improve the way that they work. So they are willing to put time, energy, and effort into it because it's something they want to do. So they will do their research. They may be a bit paranoid because it could be risky. They might want some advice. They might just want a bit of hand holding. But actually, I always say they're nice customers to have, albeit they use a lot of channels, they're nice customers to have generally. Now, they can flip very quickly from a positive customer to a negative customer. We call these customers in crisis, or they could start in crisis. So, negative customers are very different beasts. Now, even just down to the chemistry of the brain, at an extreme, if you're, angry, in crisis, scared, frustrated, lots of chemicals flow into your brain at that peak, and that it ruins your short-term memory capacity for a start. It halves it. So any complex information being thrown at you is very unlikely to work. So that's why you probably wouldn't email the fire brigade to say your house is on fire for a start. So we can start to eliminate certain channels there. Actually, to be honest, the phone tends to dominate customers in crisis. They tend to want to lift up a phone and want their problem to be solved by hopefully somebody very helpful on the other end of that phone. Of course, they might do it face to face as well, but it tends to be a very human relationship. And then, okay, so we've got positive, negative. There is a neutral bit as well, because it would be exhausting if we were just always in positive and negative. We call this utilitarian, and this is the routine stuff. So as I said, the routine, buying carrots, paying bills, you don't need wow. You just need it to be easy. And that's where a lot of the self-service tools potentially can come in. So what we've really done there is to try and say, how much information can we gather? I mean, obviously, if you've got an existing relationship with the customer, hopefully you've got some idea of where their mindset might be, what they're trying to do. Obviously, in a B2C sense, it's how much data can I get up front about what's happened with that customer. And then can I start to paint a picture from a customer journey perspective as to what channels are they likely to want to use? And then can you overlay that with signposting? So, try and if they're likely to be in crisis and they're likely to want to talk to somebody, put a big phone number up.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I can't remember where it was, but I was watching a video about this the other day, and it was somebody talking about the fact that there was a kind of get the number off the website sort of period of time.
Yes.
But actually, it doesn't matter how many other channels you've got. Like you said, a customer in a position of trying to solve a problem just wants to deal with it right now. And for all of us, the quickest way is still the phone.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's almost like put the number back on the website and make it really, because there are still people out there doing that. It's like hide the phone number, and you spend 20 minutes looking. It's like where's Wally on the website for phone numbers.
Yeah, absolutely.
You must find it quite interesting for yourself when you find yourself in that state of enhanced irritation, and you're like, okay, let's keep it simple. My memory is halved.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yes, I must confess, my inner usability person frequently is screaming on some of this stuff. So, I think even little things. I was trying to book some theatre tickets the other day, and it was a production I really wanted to see. So I was stressed, and I was in a queue, and there were about 400 people in front of me, and I'm thinking, am I going to get a ticket?
To put your payment details in.
I know, and then it was the worst user interface I've ever seen, and it was like, I'm stressed already.
I know.
How do I do this? So I did get tickets, by the way, but
nice.
But it's it wasn't the most joyous experience, and the interface was not as intuitive as it should have been.
I think, unfortunately, I don't think it's uncommon in the arts, because they probably don't have the money to invest, and yet they're probably therefore in the space where people most need it.
Yeah. Yes.
I have had a numerous poor booking experience for the arts when you just think like, somebody needs to give you a chunk of cash to sort this out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it would be very remiss of me to speak with you and not speak about the impact of the pandemic, even though maybe we're all over hearing about the impact of the pandemic. But I know you've done quite a lot of research over the last sort of 18 months, haven't you? Mm-hmm. Coming up 2 years. It's particularly around employees, is that right?
Well, both customers and employees actually looking at the changes that have happened both on the customer side. We just redid the autonomous customer. I keep saying we did this 10th anniversary thing and launched it, and it was February of 2019, which, as you probably remember, in the dim, distant past was our last month of freedom. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and we started to think, well, maybe we need to do, because normally we only do it every 2 years, and we did it just after a year. So we redid it this year as an extraordinary version, just to see had the pandemic changed customer behaviours. And to a certain extent it had, but actually mostly it hadn't.
That's crazy. In my head I was thinking, surely that's a resounding yes.
So certain things have changed. So I think certainly there are obvious things, like a lot of us are working from home if we're lucky enough to be able to do that. So that's been a change in behaviour. We have seen a significant shift to digital. So, particularly in areas where, particularly retail, to be perfectly honest, where the shops were closed, so there was no alternative but to do a lot more in the digital space. And then obviously the use of video has been the big one. So you then have to sort of say, well, what does that do in terms of translating to customer behaviors? Now, when I say things haven't changed so much, when we looked at things like customer expectation around service and customer experience, it hadn't changed an awful lot. I think the frustration bit, we were seeing a significant number of customers in crisis. We did see a massive hike in particularly our banking customers. The phone had grown. So, when you're in crisis, you tend to use the phone.
Right, yeah.
So, we're seeing trends like that. The video one's a really interesting one, because we said, well, will that then translate into us wanting to contact via video a lot more? And again, for relationship building, we did some interviews with some of our sales guys just to see how they were coping, because I think that at the very beginning of the pandemic, a lot of them were very anxious. That a lot of the relationships they built were very personal. They go for a drink, play golf. They couldn't do that anymore. So that whole socializing bit was out of the window, and they were very anxious to see, can I actually build a relationship on video? And actually, I think they were all pleasantly surprised that they could. It's not the same, but I think a lot of them were saying we didn't think we were going to be as successful. So I think that transition has been made. But video for everything, we had 85% in the survey saying that they wanted to use video more. But then when you look at, would that mean that everything is video? No, not really. And we've done quite a lot on video in the past, because it's always been one of those ones that look as if it might grow. And it has grown in certain niches. So healthcare is a very obvious one. And again, that's largely because we didn't have a lot of choice. But I think, again, as the medics have got a lot more used to doing things on video, they are actually saying, well, we don't necessarily have to see everyone face to face. We can do a lot on video. It doesn't replace it. We are seeing, high value financial services, that kind of stuff. So mortgage advice, loans, that kind of stuff. That's actually
it's interesting, that stuff as well, because I was thinking then even around the medics, I think I'd put that personally into the category of stuff I have to do but don't want to do.
Yeah.
So I'm quite happy to not waste time going to the bank to speak to the mortgage advisor or going to the doctors when I know that I just have a simple question, but I have to go through a doctor.
Yeah, exactly.
Those are the kinds of things where you're like, oh, it's going to take me an hour to go out, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So I, happily replace that boring pain in the arse with a bit of video.
Well, I mean, that links into one of the trends that's been coming out really strongly for a number of years, which is around make it easy for me.
Yes.
So easy is a really, really strong customer driver. So how do we make things very easy? And that even correlates with things like loyalty. And we use, we've been looking at this in BT internally for quite a long time. And we have something called a net easy score. And it's not rocket science. It's like the net promoter score, basically, but it's about easy. It's not rocket science that when you look at customers that are finding us difficult, they're 40% more likely to churn. So if you can start to identify those pain points, those frustrations, and try and take those out and make things a lot easier for customers, actually the bonus would then be that you're probably going to get slightly more loyal customers because they're going to come back. Now, in the survey, again, we always get this kind of seesaw between convenience and price. And it usually depends on a lot of context around economy and all that kind of thing. But convenience has topped price during the pandemic. Now, that again, it's not a surprise. We can see it in tangible behaviours, particularly at the very beginning of the pandemic when everything went a little bit hyper local. For
people
example,
got a lot of stuff to deal with. They're not going to shop around, maybe.
Yeah. And also we did see a little bit of movement on the I am finding things more difficult. But again, if we look at the context, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Everything is difficult and stressful. So I don't want organisations to make things even more difficult and stressful than they already are. So I think it kind of that kind of stuff was really brought home on the customer side. And yes, we have also been looking. Dominating a lot of my research has also been around how employees have adjusted.
Because I saw that your first BT started researching home working. Was it 95?
92.
92.
Yeah. One of my first jobs.
Crazy.
Yeah. I mean, home working. It was being dabbled with, I think, sort of late 80s. I joined BT early 90s, and we actually ran a formal experiment. And I keep saying I love experiments because, I'm a scientist for a start, but, it was bounded. So it was 1 year. We had volunteer subjects. So I think there were 11 or 12 of them. They were all effectively contact centre advisors, and they were all based in Inverness. Hence, it was called the Inverness experiment, oddly enough. So we were very original on the thinking on that. But we ran it for a year, and largely it was a technology trial to prove whether we could actually physically shift voice and data into people's houses. And yes, we could. It did come at a price tag because, we didn't have lovely things like, Wi-Fi. We didn't have broadband. We didn't have 4 or 5G. We literally had to bulldoze people's front gardens in order to get a big enough pipe into their house. So as a consequence, it was costing us around £11,000 a seat. So that's the first thing. In terms of the experiment on the financial side, it wasn't going to work in 1992, even though the technology actually did work. It was just too costly. I was part of quite a big team that was looking at some of the psychological implications of this.
I was going to ask, because completely different context to what we have now. There must have been feelings of isolation.
Yes and no. I mean, we were concerned about that one, but I actually I dug some of the research out a couple of years ago because we were starting to look at home working and future of work and things like that, and I thought it would be interesting, and thank goodness I did, because there were a lot of the discussions that were going on in 1992 we're having now, and the isolation one was really interesting. And I got a quote from one of the ladies we interviewed saying, I learnt to cook and I found out who my neighbours were, and I think that's probably what we all did during the pandemic. I certainly learned how to cook anyway.
So it's flipped the relationships away from colleagues and into
it's more community as in the local sense rather than necessarily community as in the people I see in the office. So there are certainly instances we can find of people struggling and feeling a lot more isolated. So again, there's no such thing as an average, is there? So there are people that are struggling now. But I think, it's almost, I always feel afraid to say this, but it's almost the ideal time to have a pandemic from a technological perspective, because in 1992, we didn't have a lot of the things that we take for granted now. And there were 3 things in particular that have really got us through. So connectivity. So we now do have things like broadband, Wi-Fi, 4G, 5G, cloud. So, a lot of the services that we can access without having to physically have something available to us, and also rapidly deploy it. And then the collaboration tools that we have as well. So, I mean, video, I was in BT's video team it's probably about 20 years ago, and it was supposed to be the next big thing. And again, everything pointed towards it. Yes, it probably would be, but it took a pandemic to really shift people's attitudes, because although, we had been Skyping and FaceTiming, it wasn't anywhere near the amount of Skyping and FaceTiming or Zooming now that we are now doing.
And also with the volume of people, some of Zoom or Teams meetings, you can have loads of people on the call and see their little faces bobbing around.
You certainly can, yes.
Whereas you wouldn't have done that. You might have Skyped, but I only ever Skyped on a one-on-one basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were seeing large-scale audio conferencing growing before the pandemic, but now, I mean, I think the network data, early days of the pandemic, our network data was showing a 500% growth in video traffic over the network. So we could see to the extent to which people suddenly started to connect visually. And again, there's some interesting psychology there around, were we simply trying to get that human connection? So did we want to see people's faces because we weren't seeing different people's faces when we were all completely locked down? But then there's a lot of discussion now, of course, around video fatigue. And although there are some very valid reasons for that, I mean, firstly, the fact that I'm looking at my mirror image for the entire day, which is hideous for a start. So that's a problem. The fact that it's very close, there's an
aggression element I read around eye contact.
Absolutely right. So we're in the aggressive arena for eye contact. We're kind of
I hope you don't feel that I'm being aggressive behavior.
But yeah, I mean, it's not even conscious, to be honest. So there are aspects to that, but I actually don't think it's video that's the problem. It's meetings. And I think that's the big, in fact, I want to try and do some research on this, because I think the temptation was, and there are lots of motivators to do this, because it's frictionless now. You don't have to book a room or commute or anything, that you can very easily have a meeting, and you can, as you said, have lots of people in the meeting as well. So let's have lots of meetings, and let's partition them in 30 to 60 minute segments, and let's put it for the whole day. Now, I think that's the reason why we're getting fatigue. And even Microsoft did some fabulous research of the effects of endless death by meeting days on the brain. And you could actually see the brain starting to burn out. And particularly, I was talking to a professional services client a couple of weeks back, and they said that they'd measured that the average time between meetings, between clicking on and clicking off, was 7 seconds. So we've got 7 seconds to recover from one meeting and go to another. So, I mean, so there's been a lot of suggestion as to how to solve this. And I don't think it's as straightforward as let's have 25-minute meetings and 50-minute meetings instead of 30 and 60. Then, of course, there's the meeting-free day. So there is some mileage in that. But the problem then is you end up, so if you have a meeting-free Friday,
save your meetings.
you then have an absolutely jam-packed Monday to Thursday. So I think the problem there is, the analog concept of a meeting is very easy to lift and shift into the digital world, but it's also, maybe we should just step back and say, should this be a meeting? Can we do this in another way? And I think the function of meetings, if you sort of take an anthropological view, probably people's attitudes toward meetings are very different. So the reason that people do a meeting, particularly managers actually, is that they want to, management is the social function. You want to talk to people, you want to problem solve. So you'll have a meeting. And then you have the sort of the makers perspective where, actually the meeting is regarded more as a distraction than a part of their work. That then becomes an interruption and you can't get the rest of your work done. So there are sort of different motivations as to why people want to do meetings, not least I look busy if I have lots of meetings. And again, that can be a big problem.
Yeah. It's like, well, I don't really want to do any of the work, so let's just talk about this.
Well, there is that talking about the work rather than doing the work problem. But I think particularly when you can't see people in an office, there is a temptation to say, hey, well, how do I know that they're working? Well, if I engage them constantly in meetings, that feels like work, doesn't it? It looks busy and productive. That's
like the old school presenteeism, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is.
I'm here. I'm not doing anything, just so you're aware, but I'm here.
Exactly right. But I think, if you look at remote first organizations prior to the pandemic, they tended to be a lot more asynchronous. So in other words, they would use a lot of written tools, actually. So it would be more of a written culture. They probably be very open and they make the work very transparent. So, it will be up there. They'll be discussing things asynchronously, and particularly when you're global, that's an advantage because obviously you've got the time zone problem as well to cope with. And they only tend to come together synchronously when it matters. If you want real-time decision making, it's difficult to do that asynchronously. So let's come and do it synchronously. And a lot of them also use office hours windows, I guess. So rather than saying, well, I'm going to have meetings from 8 till 6, I'm only going to have meetings maybe from 1 till 4 or something. So, and again, it might pack that small period of time with meetings for sure, but then you've actually got some space to move around those meetings during an average working day. So, yeah.
I was listening to a podcast as well that was sort of saying that there's, and I can't remember who it was, so it's useless information, but it was talking about depending on what type of meeting it is, depends on what type of day you should have it. So if it's a meeting where you have to be creative, then you should have it, was it in the afternoon? No, in the morning. And then if it's just kind of administrative, then so correct my ignorance. If we do assume there's no average client, customer, employee, how are they getting that data? Or is it just...
I mean, those kind of surveys, I do think sometimes maybe don't quite hit academic research standards. I mean, I would question, certainly there are, I mean, apparently Monday is the day we're most aggressive. So I don't quite know why that's the case, but
well, it's Monday today, so it's the day. I'll report back at the end of the day and let you know.
Scientific study. I don't know. I mean, I think the problem is that we're all different, and that with a lot of the stuff, there's a lot of talk about hybrid working at the moment. Hybrid is a very difficult way of working because, again, there is no such thing as average, and you have to kind of cope with a lot of different things, and that would include individual differences, team differences, obviously differences in terms of the kind and type of work that you're doing. And how collaborative it is, and obviously the organizational requirements as well. So, I mean, in terms of individual differences, we know that different people, I mean, even just on introverts versus extroverts, which you could question I think, the validity of introversion and extroversion has been questioned, but as a fairly well understood research concept, we can see tangibly that introverts and extroverts work in very different ways. And actually, there's been quite a lot of study as to, did introverts or extroverts cope better with the pandemic? Well, I've actually seen studies that almost contradict each other, but largely the studies that I have seen have said that introverts have coped slightly better, but don't like the video component. So the death by meeting days tends to affect the introverts worse than the extroverts. The extroverts tend to have struggled because, of course, they draw their energy
from
other
others.
people, and that they're the people that are having a lot of video meetings, oddly enough,
Yeah.
because that's what that's how they actually
probably are missing the social side.
they are very much
introverts are like, I'm okay for that.
Absolutely right. So I mean, there's that aspect to it. Obviously, other things that have impacted how productive people have been from home is, do you have the right place? Do you have a place, a room of one's own? I believe Virginia, I've just read Virginia Woolf's Room of One Own. Wow, that's an incredibly powerful treatise that it instantly said to me that actually, if you do have a room of your own, you're very productive on a number of levels, and also implies a certain financial stability as well.
That's it, isn't there? There's a huge socio-economic element that has to be considered, and that businesses have to think about as well as they now decide what they're going to do going forwards.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, there's that the sort of actual home situation. Obviously, connectivity can play into that as well, and obviously, who you've got in your home. And certainly, we did see, and there's been quite a lot of research on gender. We know that women have tended to struggle a lot more, mainly because the bulk of the childcare requirements always falls on the women. Not always, obviously. There are male carers that have been impacted as well. But actually, I mean, in a lot of BT's experience in the past, particularly with things like flexible working, which is slightly different to hybrid, and I'll talk about that in a minute probably. But flexible working, I think. Certainly when we instituted it in BT, which again was quite early, we got 97% of our women coming back after maternity leave, because it gives you the flexibility to work around what you need to do in terms of caring. So I think, actually that's why I think a lot of employees are now saying they can see the advantages of being able to choose where, when and how they work. And that then brings you into, I think most organizations are talking about this notion of hybrid at the moment. But hybrid to me isn't flexible working, because flexible working has been around for a while, and it's relatively well understood, although obviously we haven't done it necessarily to the scale that we're seeing now. But hybrid working, and I use an analogy on this one. So hybrid working, I use my favorite hybrid, which is the Zedonk. The Zedonk is half zebra and half donkey. Now, I keep saying that the Zedonk does not spend 3 days a week as a zebra and 2 days a week as a donkey. It is, in fact, a different breed. So this isn't all about how many days you spend in an office. This is ultimately around trying to reinvent work so that it makes place and time effectively redundant. So it doesn't matter where you are, it doesn't matter when you're working. It's all about the work effectively. So it's work and employee experience that actually make the difference. And that means that's a very big problem. So, you've got to start to reinvent work so that it is transparent and visible to everyone. That actually, I think the big one on a psychological level is proximity bias. So we tend to have biases when we do see people on a day-to-day basis because we're tribal. It's how our brains have been wired. So we mustn't just assume that people in the office are the people that are working. In fact, the evidence is that people that are working remotely tend to work longer hours. So actually, and you could argue, productivity is an interesting one because how we measure it is probably deeply flawed. But I think productivity has not dipped during this huge period of remote working. So one could argue that, is it productive to be in an office or not? There again are arguments for and against. And again, you can't just say one size fits all, because I think the office has a phenomenal social function. It's there as a collaboration tool, it's there as a communication tool, and it's a very powerful way to build community. So I think it has its really strong functions, but do I need to be there to work all the time? Not necessarily, because work has kind of left the building. So there are other options, which would include home, but would also include my favorite place to work prior to the pandemic was what I used to call the coffees. So because coffee, I am fueled by coffee, so that's the important bit. But that would be a coffee shop or a hotel lobby, or I mean, it could get as formal as a WeWork, but those places that are not a 2-hour commute away but aren't the home
Yeah.
I think that's quite an interesting one as well. That I think is starting to flourish again, because it was really, I think 2% of London property, office property at one point was co-working space. So we can see that, but we're also seeing, rural regeneration.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting, whether they're community based, more local.
The Irish government has very entertainingly published a rural regeneration document that includes what I call the POFIS, which is community pubs being used potentially as co-working spaces.
There is a flaw. What's the flaw?
Well, you joke, but there were some pubs prior to the pandemic that were offering unlimited coffee all day if you wanted to come and work in there. So they weren't encouraged. I think they gave you a free pint at the end of the day. Well.
Here's your reward.
Absolutely.
What are you guys looking at in terms of trends then for the next post-pandemic, or as we move out of the pandemic? Are you expecting us to forget everything we learned?
I hope not. We are creatures of habit, but I keep saying habits usually take 3 to 4 months to bed in. So considering we are quite considerably more months into doing things very differently, I think some of our habits may have become a little bit more ingrained. So I'm hoping that we have learned a lot. Not everything has gone perfectly during the pandemic. As I said, I think the extent to which people have struggled or not with homeworking has been entirely dependent on their circumstances. And, I think we've grown to realise that the office might have some functions that we hadn't anticipated. So I would hope that we have learnt from that. But I mean, I think, I hate the word new normal. I'm not sure there is going to be any normal, to be perfectly honest, because of course we have climate change as well to try and cope with, which is arguably a bigger crisis. So not only do we have to reinvent things like work to make it better for people, we also need to reinvent it to make it better for the planet as well. So there's a lot of things I think that we've learned. I think the taking away a lot of those positives I think is essential, but I think retaining that experimental mindset is also really important, particularly, as I said, hybrids. I think hybrid working is quite difficult. I think some organizations have done it for a while and have sort of invented the rules around it. But I think a lot of us are sort of going into this fairly blind, and things are going to go horribly wrong. There are going to be horrible hybrids. Not least, I mean, the one that we're used to is the one where people are split between a physical meeting room and a digital space. And I think we've learnt that actually having everyone as a celebrity square on a screen actually works pretty well. And that implies that if you're in a split meeting, a hybrid meeting, that everyone in the physical space is still sitting on a video conference. So that's an interesting adjustment that needs to be made.
I heard somebody the other day, they were saying that they were having a meeting where it was physical if people wanted to be physical, but that you were all still on Zoom, so the people not in the room.
Absolutely.
Then there's something very odd about that for the people sat in the room.
There is, and again, proximity bias can come in because still the room might dominate, and I think a lot of that is to do with how the meetings are chaired as well. And I think that's an underrated skill.
There are some poor chairs out there, aren't there?
There are some incredibly poor chairs, but then when it makes life more difficult if you're split between meetings. I think hybrid events are going to be really interesting, certainly for the marketing community.
Live streaming and all that kind of thing.
I mean, I actually did a physical event a couple of weeks back, my first physical event, and that was weird because there were only about 10 people in the room and about 100 in the virtual space, so it was very strange. But even then the room tended to dominate, despite the fact that there were way more people in the digital space. So I think that there's that challenge. But I think with hybrid meetings and hybrid events, certainly there is quite a lot of call to keep them hybrid. Now, not least accessibility. I've got a couple of friends who are wheelchair bound who would have been able to get to events, but it's a lot harder for them to do.
It's more of a planning.
And they've had a great year and a half, because they've actually been able to attend pretty much everything they wanted to attend with no problem whatsoever. So I think not least to cater for people that maybe find it a little bit more difficult to access the events. I think it's quite important to maintain some aspect of hybridity. I think the problem then is the sort of social side of the events, where the networking bit, that's the bit that is a little bit clunkier in digital space. I did actually go to a fully augmented reality conference very early on, actually, in the pandemic, and it was the closest I got to being at a physical event, because we had avatars, and they weren't particularly flattering. I was a little blocky avatar with a smile and a BT logo on my front, but so. It wasn't sartorial elegance or anything, but you could move together and away from people. There were tables, and the sound changed as well. So as you got nearer to people, you could hear them. As you got further away, and you could hear a general buzz as well, so you could hear that other people were talking.
Interesting.
So that technology is a little on the clunky side, but actually that was a really good way of reproducing things. I think the problem at the moment is there's a lot of talk about serendipity, and I think some people are insisting that can only happen physically, and I disagree, because I think you can do digital serendipity. I just think it's harder to do digital serendipity because it's probably not quite as serendipitous. You have to plan it, and there are some quite scary technologies coming out. There's one app that is a little bit like Tinder for the workplace. So what it tries to do is to match you with people with similar interests, and if you swipe, it suggests that you go for a virtual coffee with them. Now I have to say, I'm an introvert, and that absolutely terrifies me, but I have to say, even talking to some of my more extroverted friends, they were going, not sure about that.
No.
So I think the spirit is there. I think we're seeing a little bit more interesting stuff going on around sort of more of an introduction service than a sort of dating service, around how do you exploit networks and actually be introduced to somebody by a third party that sort of thing. And obviously there's social media as well, which I think maybe slightly overlooked, but that value of connection there. Now I think the majority of the meaningful connections I've got on something like LinkedIn or Twitter, often I've met them.
Really?
But often they broker relationships with other people I haven't met that are quite interesting. So I think there's elements there around how do we use those kind of networks also to introduce, it's not quite serendipity, but introduce.
No, but then I think people overplay the value of the serendipity, and actually, you could, so let's say you did it through a networking event, and over the course of 12 months, you might have a decent serendipitous introduction once.
Yes.
Whereas if you use social media and connections in a way where you purposefully say, hello, I know I don't know you, but I'd like to connect, I'd like to pick your brains, I'd like a conversation. I think if we're more all open to asking for that, and more all open to saying yes to that when we're asked, then that's a more productive way. Isn't that the fail fast rule as well? Because if you don't like them or it's not useful, then it's unconnect.
Yeah, absolutely. And the frustration with it only happens in an office or at an event is that all of the interesting people need to be in the office or at the event. They're probably not, frankly, but there will be some interesting people there, but actually the connections may be in different countries for a start. So I've actually just been introduced to some absolutely fascinating people doing some really interesting stuff in Africa that I've not been to Africa recently, but I am actually having a conversation with them. So it can be done digitally. It can be very powerful digitally. It's just the mechanisms to do it, and maybe also our networking is not a skill. London Business School did some stuff on this. Networking is a skill that not many of us possess, to be honest. I think it was one in 4 of us are good networkers, and I'm terrible. So it is a skill though, so you can technically teach it. And I think we were looking at potentially putting something like networking as a skill into our graduate program, because these are our leaders for tomorrow. So how do they network, not just in a physical room, which a lot of them are quite uncomfortable doing anyway, including me, to be perfectly honest, but how do they do that on a digital basis? So I think that there might well be a fair amount of work around how do we harness that power of the human network, and how do we get those behaviors and train people to be better at networking.
Good luck with that one. I think it's easy to categorize the people that are good at networking in the way that we all imagine are the people that you wouldn't want to network with.
Well, there is that. I always use the example that the best networkers are like the perfect party hosts.
They're looking after.
They look after you. They know a little bit about you, and they then are willing to introduce you to other people that they think will be interesting to you. So, I mean, I think that's the ideal networker, as opposed to the rather obnoxious networker, which can also exist.
In their masses. I'm very aware of giving you your time back, but I'm really just wanting to ask you lastly and quickly, future technologies. So obviously from a marketer's perspective, we talked a bit about AR and VR, and I know it's an annoying one, but where are we with things like holograms?
Holograms, I mean, it's early days on that one at the moment. There's something called volumetric video, which we're doing a fair amount with, which I always say is my Star Wars fantasies basically come true. So, I am longing to stand in front of my team as Princess Leia and say, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope." I've yet to do it, but it's feasible to do now. The only thing is it's quite clunky. So it does produce a hologram. You have to use multiple cameras to do it. It can be done. But I keep saying, if you look at what video was, 20 years ago, that was also incredibly clunky. And
so
I remember
20 years and another pandemic, and then we're going to have holograms.
Well, hopefully it won't need another pandemic. But I think the holographic stuff, we are definitely doing quite a lot of proof of concepts on at the moment. It's not perfect, and obviously the very nature of a proof of concept means that we hopefully learn, and we can make the technology better. But I think, again, it relies on that very high definition connectivity that I was talking about very, very much at the beginning. So 5G actually would be ideal for that kind of technology. So that's why we're looking at it, frankly, because it's part of that digital fabric vision. I mean, it's so early days, we haven't really done an awful lot, but I think that ability to read more subtle body language, to have more than just a head, to actually have a full figure, to be able to manipulate things in digital space where you can actually see people coming together. I think that could be a very interesting way of doing things. And again, is friendly for the climate, hopefully, as well. So we can start to do more compelling things without the need necessarily to fly halfway around the planet to do it. So I think holograms are one to watch, and it's quite a hyped one at the moment because it's relatively new and people are very excited. But I think I'm excited about it, to be honest. But it's going to take a few years, I suspect, for the technology to become smaller, more feasible, more well. I mean, it's starting to become more cost effective. But watch this space.
It's going to take sort of the live stream event to a new level. Maybe.
Yeah, well, it's certainly been done live at events as well. I mean, we just, even a few years back with was it Tupac or someone like that they projected onto a stage, recreated him. But yeah, I mean, I think that kind of technology is starting to become something that's much more feasible on a much lower scale and lower budget.
It might be a while before one of the Marketing Forum events has a hologram.
Well, I don't know.
Well, if it happens, I'll give you a shout, and then you can come and have your Princess Leia moment.
I will come as Princess Leia.
Would you have to dress up as Princess Leia, or can you just make? You wouldn't have to just make the hologram do it.
Yeah, I could probably manufacture the sticky cinnamon buns.
That could be messy. Thank you so much for joining us. It was so interesting to hear, obviously from the marketing point of view around some of the customer trends and data that you're coming across, but also around the work element. I almost want to pick your brains for like another hour around what's coming through from these surveys, because I just can imagine, you know, that volume of data and particularly this, I mean, the pandemic's going to be so interesting in another 10 years when you look at what it changed.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll give you a shout.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Nicola. It was great having you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Marketing Forum podcast. If you are not already, please do like and subscribe. And you can follow us on social media or subscribe to our mailing list to find out more about episodes coming your way soon.